On the central plains of North America, a few animal species like bison and birds of prey seem tied to the landscape. But none seems to belong here more than the prairie dog. And among these prairie dog towns that can stretch for miles, there's a special predator that relies on prairie dogs for its very existence: the black-footed ferret.
Well, the black-footed ferret's a pretty small animal, but it lives in really big country. And despite the fact that it's small, it's a top-end predator in its ecosystem. It's dependent upon prairie dogs. More than 90% of its food, as well as the burrows where it provides shelter for the ferret.
Historically, they were across the landscape throughout the Great Plains associated with white-tailed prairie dogs, Gunnison prairie dogs, and black-tailed prairie dogs, which covered, basically from the northern part of Mexico all the way up to extreme southern part of Canada.
Black-footed ferrets were once common on these plains, but they were driven to near extinction in the early 20th century. Now, it's one of the rarest mammals in the United States.
The prairie dog is considered the keystone species of the entire ecosystem. You pull one thing out, and the whole thing collapses. The ferret, on the other hand, is considered a flagship species. So if we can save the ferret, we can save this entire prairie world, 130 unique plants and animals that are unique to North America.
Today, close to 1,000 black-footed ferrets are surviving on these plains, thanks almost entirely to a large-scale conservation effort led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
We house approximately 70% of the world's captive black-footed ferrets for breeding purposes.
In Colorado, ferrets are bred in this conservation center and then trained to live in the harsh world outside this controlled environment.
The black-footed ferrets are managed in order to minimize loss of genetic diversity. So we have a core captive colony of about 300 individuals, and then we determine the animals that are going to be reintroduction candidates based on genetics.
In these holding pens, ferrets face the elements of the natural world for the first time, learning the skills they'll need for the next step, reintroduction into the wild.
All the black-footed ferrets that go out for reintroduction spend a minimum of 30 days in these pens. About 200 individuals per year, kits, come out into the pens either with or without their mom. Black-footed ferrets would start separating from their moms about 120 days of age. So we want to make sure the kits and the mom come out right around 60 days of age, so they get an extended period of time to experience life in an underground burrow system and have the opportunity to kill live prey, which for these guys is prairie dogs.
They're undeniably cute and charismatic, but prairie dogs have long been considered a nuisance species throughout the Great Plains, particularly among ranchers. There have been sustained campaigns to cull their numbers, and because their fates are intertwined, as prairie dogs became more scarce, ferrets declined as well.
The prairie dog, they were kind of being attacked on all fronts. You had a growing human population moving west, converting prairie habitat to agricultural land. You start fragmenting habitat, and animals can't get from one area to the other. You have diseases that can wipe out a population, and that's what happened on the western side of things. Sylvatic plague, an exotic disease from Asia, came in and started wiping out the rodents, the ground squirrels in California, then moved into the prairie dogs.
By the late 1950s, it was feared that black-footed ferrets were extinct.
What happened is gradually prairie dog complexes decreased in size and they were further and further apart. Larger impacts were related to poisoning campaigns where their prairie dogs were removed, their food was removed, and then plague, which directly killed them, which is carried by a flea vector. And it's the same plague that affected humans throughout human history.
A small population of ferrets was discovered in South Dakota in 1964, but they died out soon after. And then, in 1981, there was new hope for the species when another previously unknown colony was found in Wyoming.
September 26, 1981 is when a ranch dog named Shep actually rediscovered the species. So when we found those animals at Meeteetse, Wyoming, we had a second opportunity to set the species on the road to recovery.
20 ferrets were rescued and became the nucleus for the current restoration effort.
We've produced over 7,700 kits in captivity. We've released over 2,700 kits in 8 states in the US, as well as Mexico and Canada. And we now have about 1,000 black-footed ferrets in the wild.
Today, a group of these ferrets is graduating from this breeding room at the Conservation Center.
This is kind of a room full of males and female black-footed ferrets that are part of the breeding program. Today we're moving some of the animals that have gone through the preconditioning process of munching on live prairie dogs, and they're being trapped up this morning from their individual cages to head off to a reintroduction setup in South Dakota, and that's called the Bad River Ranch. We're going to put them in individual kennels, load them on up in the truck, and then send them down on the road to recovery.
Most ferret reintroduction sites are on publicly owned land. Bad River Ranch in South Dakota is unique in that it's one of the few sites on private land.
You would think that in a country the size of the U.S., that there would be sufficient habitat that they could live and carry out their life functions. But it's hard to have the right habitat, especially on private land. A lot of people don't want prairie dogs.
If you're a landowner and you have a small land holding for the West and you have a few hundred head of cattle, you're trying to make it and you look out your pickup window and you see prairie dogs clipping down the grass, consuming the grass, particularly in the dry years it just looks like it's dirt. You're going to say to yourself, I can't afford to have those on my landscape, particularly in those concentrations.
Owned by entrepreneur and conservationist Ted Turner, Bad River Ranch sets an example of how conservation and commerce can exist together.
You can have a lot of wildlife, a lot of non-consumptive species out there as well, and still have a profitable ranching effort.
Though it makes a great temporary home, Bad River Ranch is not the final destination for this group of ferrets. Here, their progress will be monitored as they prepare for their permanent relocation site.
So right now what we're doing is we're spotlighting for black-footed ferrets that we released last night. Once we get to the burrow, we'll put a transponder reader down which will read a microchip in the ferret that will help us identify the individual ferret. What we'll do is we'll monitor these ferrets very intensively for a week to 10 days, keep track of them, find out where they're moving, then we'll leave. And we'll come back in a month and recapture these ferrets, assuming that the ferrets that have survived are the most fit, and actually move them to a more permanent release site in New Mexico. This is where the ferrets learn to be ferrets.
Although this conservation effort has a long way to go, the goals are clear.
We played a role in their decline. This basically is America's backyard. The Great Plains goes right down the backbone of the United States. So it is our responsibility to do the best we can to try and restore not only the black-footed ferret, but also that ecosystem, 130 plants and animals unique to North America, for future generations to enjoy.